Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew McCall. Looking forward to our second conversation. It's like 3 years, over three
Yeah,
years. It's the last one for the podcast, Matthew.
me too. Very much
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
I do, though, remember the space that we touched right at the end of the conversation, still sending nice shivers down my spine, right? Not scared, but just we touched somewhere, we took touch where somewhere pretty deep. Um, do you remember that? Is that just
Yeah.
me? Yeah,
No, no, yeah, totally. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it's always interesting too, like just sort of where conversations start and what they lead to and kind of the path that gets you there and all of that. And I think especially when you're talking about adoption and or any sort of coming together of individuals into a family, right? There's such it there's such a deep and rich emotional component to all of that there's a lot of opportunity for really I don't know, really powerful kind of stuff. So
yeah.
anyway, yeah.
And it's deep, yeah, and it's an intentionally deep, and not many people want deep. Most people want shallow. Like we only go
Sometimes, yeah.
deep. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's an opportunity, right, to like to find those reasons or those times when it makes more sense to really um explore all that there is within a certain relationship or a certain connection or whatever is I don't know, to me, like part of what makes living a human life more interesting because we have that ability to really think in those kind of deeper, more profound sort of ways. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that's the magic, and I think that for me is almost our healing space.
Hmm.
The peace. It's got there's a I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the guy was talking about the silence behind the silence.
Hmm. Yep.
And it's but it's not a silence with nothing. It's got a hum, it's got a resonance, it's got an electricity, it's got a vibe about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the things, I don't know if you've caught on to this, listeners, but one of the things that we've been doing at the moment is revisiting some old friends, reconnected with some old friends, and one of the themes that we've got is this idea of a pendulum, and the idea that pendulums have a habit, and that's what they do. They swing too far. Before 93, when Nancy Verrier came up with the primal wound, there was this notion that adoption was what do people call it? Rainbows and unicorns.
Yeah.
And then it's sudden in those last 32 years, it swung too far the other way,
Hmm.
where we seem to have a trauma obsession, when being trauma informed, trauma responsive, but hope and healing and thriving obsessed would do us a lot more good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that's the thing is like, how do you find the right balance between those two? Like whenever we kind of swing too far to one of the ends, if you're too focused on trauma all the time and you're too focused on that idea that like there were so many injuries, there were so many losses, there was so much harm that was done that brought a young person to the place of being adopted, that brought a family to the place of choosing adoption as their approach to growing their family. You miss out on the fact that, like, for one, that's not true for everyone, and not true as an entirely, but you also miss out on, like, there's all this really wonderful stuff that also is happening. And I think on the other side of that spectrum, there's the same thing, right? If you completely ignore that any of those traumas are or could be there and only focus on, no, this is wonderful, and you go back to focusing on the rainbows and the unicorns, um, you miss out on stuff with that as well. And I think to that idea of how do you create more of a a deep and meaningful interaction. That comes again, I think, when you balance those two ends of the spectrum and sort of come together in the middle to like acknowledge that like yeah there may be and for many people part of that adoption journey is some harm and some trauma and some difficulty and sometimes a lot of that, and there are these beautiful, wonderful, amazing, happy, exciting moments, and bringing both of those together, I think, and reconciling those things together just makes all of us better human beings and more complete families and all of that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. So where does the rubber hit the road for you on this, Matthew?
I mean, I think a lot of it's just, what's the approach that we take as parents to raising our children? And then beyond that, as providers, like how do we then support that work within those arenas, right? Like, so if if we're everything from like the very beginning of the adoption process for children and for parents, like helping to talk about both ends of the spectrum and the good and the bad and the everywhere in between, because that's the other reality is like most of parenting, any parenting, most of it is like there's a lot of going to 5-year-olds, soccer games and watching 5-year-olds randomly kick a ball around a field for an hour is not the most fun, exciting, or engaging thing for most people. It might be cute for a little while, but then, just kind of the drudgery of being a parent at some point, kind of a thing. And it's like acknowledging to me all of that stuff that really matters. And I think, some of that starts with us as professionals that do work with an adoption, making sure that we are balancing all of those things out. Massachusetts, we do a training that we have to do when parents are getting ready to start their adoption journey and are interested in adopting children through our child welfare system. They go through this training, and a lot of the focus of that training is on what that adoption journey is for that young person, the histories that they may be coming with, the challenges that may present themselves in that. Um, and there's a lot of focus on the trauma, the big T's and the little T's and everywhere in between. And there is some amount of bringing in the good as well. And I think, how do we emphasize that stuff as much, right? We all, as part of the way that we do them, we have adoptive parents come in and talk about their experiences, folks that have adopted their kids, recently or many years ago. Some of them, their children are now adults, will come in and talk about what their journey looked like. And I think they, as much as anybody, oftentimes are able to bring in that balance of like, look at like, there's tough stuff in this. And there are so many wonderful, amazing, happy, fun moments that it's really important to hold on to those things too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that's become clear to me over the last year, 18 months or so, is that this I, trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, I think.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it seems to me, having talked to so many different people, that the wound, on one level, there's a wound, perhaps from a psychological perspective. There's a wound, and yet underneath that psychology, a there's an unwoundable
Mm.
core.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, it's it's hard, right? Because like each individual person comes with their own story and their own experience of those things, right? You see this sometimes in individuals who experience trauma together. You'll have someone that's like, on a bus where it's there's a big accident, and you talk to different people that might just be sitting directly next to each other on that bus, that will tell you almost two entirely different stories about what that was like for them and what they experienced and what they remember and all of that. And the reality is like, there are clients and families that I've worked with that have incredible trauma that for them, at least in those moments, in that time that I'm working with them, is very present for them much of the day. And I do think it's important to like to acknowledge and to be okay with like if this is where you are right now, that's okay. It's all right that you're experiencing these difficulties and these challenges. And part of the recovery from that is going to be to start focusing on the fact that there is underlying all of that every day good things. And then unfortunately what we end up doing is, the whole concept of like neurons that fire together wire together, right? The more that we think about something, the more that we focus on that something, the more readily we're able to pick up on it and notice it and pay attention to it. And so when you ask that person, how was your day? If they have a very trauma mindset, a very like injury and wounded mindset, then they're going to point out the five things that happened that day that weren't great. um, that same person a year later who might be in a very different space and they've worked on their mind to get to this place of focusing on the good that's happening. Those same five things may have happened that day that weren't great, but they'll tell you about the five best things that happened that day. And both of those experiences are true. And it's not that one is wrong or incorrect, but which of those two is going to give you a more positive outlook on your life? Which of those two is going to make your day a better one? Um, and so how do we start to shift that mindset in that direction? It's really, really, really hard work for some people because they're so ingrained into, for good reason sometimes, so ingrained into thinking about what happened and the trauma of what happened and the fear of that thing happening again, that it can be really hard to lift your head up and notice the good that's happening. And the irony of that, or the challenge in that, is the more that you notice the good, the easier it's going to be for you to see that going forward. And I think that's, the adoptive parents that come and speak on our panel that I'm always the most appreciative of, are the ones that do acknowledge, like, yes, there are tough days and hard days. And quite honestly, much of those tough days and hard days are the hard stuff that every single parent faces. Like it is not easy to raise a teenager. Forget any other history stuff, forget any other things in their background. Teenagers can be challenging and bring stuff up that's really hard and difficult for parents to navigate and decide what to do and all of that. But again, if we have this more positive mindset, if we're more focused on the things that are going right in our relationship with our teenager than the things that are going wrong, we have a more positive outlook. And those families are often the ones that will say, yeah, there are these difficult days, but the stuff I choose to focus on is this and this and this. Even in the hard stuff, I choose to focus on the best parts of that hard stuff. Even when my kid is angry with me, I choose to focus on the fact that they're engaging with me, even though that engagement might not be something that I particularly enjoy in that moment. It means that they're still connected and they still want a relationship and are still focusing on their relationship with me. Um, obviously not in like a Pollyanna, like I'm going to gloss over anything bad and pretend like the world is wonderful all the time, but in a way that just focuses on the inherent goodness, that sort of underlying um that underlying state of being that we want to be in, which is very much that like we're good and we're okay and things are going to be good and be okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
What helps people see that?
I think some of it is really taking a very intentional approach of like looking at our thinking and noticing what we're paying attention to. And that oftentimes takes good people in their lives, whether it's, a professional that they're working with, or it's friends or family members or clergy or whoever it is that they're working with to try to see that. People that are able to point that thinking out for them. Certainly there are other ways to do it. There are books that you can read. There are all that kind of stuff. And then really putting in the hard work, because at first it's not natural, like in anything else that we do, right? Like if I decided to learn, I don't know, if I decided to learn how to knit, at first those movements would be incredibly awkward and unnatural and feel clunky, and I'm sure that I would knit something that looks nothing like the thing I was trying to knit and all of that. because at first it doesn't work great. Like at first, when I start to try to focus on the good and the sort of purity of the moment, I'm going to struggle and fail against that. And so it's being able to put in the hard work to get past those things and start to get to the place where you can actually start to make something really beautiful of it. I also think it takes the right environment to do that in. The reality is I can have the best mindset ever to try to work on that and a lot of really good and helpful friends around me. But if I'm living in an environment where my basic needs aren't being met or and that includes things like safety and a felt sense of belonging and things along those lines, it can be really, really hard to do that work. I have a couple of good friends that do work in prisons as clinicians, and it's one of the things they often talk about is like they'll have these clients that are like so ready to start working on the traumas that oftentimes led them into a life that got them to the place where they were arrested, and yet the environment of prison is so counter to what you need in order to be able to do that work that despite their readiness, despite their clear thinking about what they need to do, it's just impossible to do in that environment because of all the other stuff that's there. And so, how do we create that, like as a society, as individuals, as parents, as all of that? How do we create those places for individuals to feel safe enough to work on that stuff? I forget who wrote it, but there was a book. I think the title is Islands of Competence or something along those lines that sort of talked about like how do you, for kids with like trauma and kids with difficult upbringings, like what do we do to find those places where those kids feel incredibly competent and capable and things along those lines. And I think the same thing for families, like how do we find that those places, those moments in which we feel this is an area of competence for us, and then build on that and make sure that we continue to grow those areas out because it's really hard to gain success in really difficult environments. Yeah. And I think that's part of it, right? Is like that overall balance of everything. Like how do we not end up too polarized in our approaches to most things? It's usually finding, the relative middle ground that gets us to a better place with that stuff.
Yeah. You make a very interesting point about our environment, and I'm thinking about that social media environment that we're
Yeah.
in as well.
Yep.
That we were talking about polarization in politics. Clearly, there's a lot of polarization in politics. Clearly, that's polarizing people on
Mhm.
social media, and we need to be um, mindful, I think, of the vibe of the people around
Mhm.
us in social media, especially if we're in groups. Are those groups helping us move forward? Are they helping us focus on growth and
Yeah.
shifting? You use a great word, shifting, right? And what came to my mind, so we talked about shifting. We talked about shifting over time. You've mentioned. And the other thing that came to mind is there is another thing that's become very clear to me recently. There is no one primal wound. It is
Yeah.
it is a scale.
Yeah,
Is it
for
is
sure.
a scale.
A- And it's human beings are just so much more complex than any one aspect of who we are, right? You look at all the collective experiences that make up this moment of consciousness that I have right now. Like there have been billions and billions of little moments of experience that have brought me to this place. And I think to try to boil it down, like I've certainly had a lot of it, people that, it's this is the thing, this is the moment, this is the whatever that's causing this. And it's like, not to say that that might not be one of the bigger issues or bigger moments or whatever for somebody, but there's all the surrounding ones that make such a big difference to that. And again, to that point of like individuals that go through very, very similar things but have very different outcomes. Like, why is that? And oftentimes when you look at it, there's all these other moments that surround it that make the experience of that bad thing look really different to the person or be experienced really different by them. And so, what are we doing for creating that kind of stuff? And I think going back to that idea of like the pendulum, right? Like you go on social media and you look at videos, like you see these huge number of like fail videos of people just miserably bombing at whatever the thing is in there, right? And sort of the sort of joyful mirth that kind of comes from people with that. But on the other side of that spectrum, you see these ones of like people doing these unbelievable, crazy, hard things perfectly. Um, and I think, to me, one of the ones that often, again, like I'll appreciate about it is there are some of those people that do those like perfect videos where they'll show you like this took me 22 hours to do and umpteen attempts, and like that's the reality of what life is. Like you get to that perfect whatever, right, that perfect shot or that perfect thing through over and over and over and over again, persisting through things that may be really challenging and at times really fun and engaging and at other times really hard and at other times really boring. And how do we find that middle space that is like, you know, that life is good and good things happen, but that doesn't mean life needs to be perfect for good things to happen. It doesn't mean that you need everything to be just right, and it doesn't mean that you need to focus on and work through all of your trauma perfectly to get to that place. It's I think acknowledging and really focusing on the balance of those things that becomes really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You used the word persisting that persistence, and I was thinking about another word, kind of very uh, similar word to me, or related word earlier, about 10 minutes ago when you were saying something else. I was thinking about patience, you
Hmm.
know,
Yeah.
patience and persistence. And we don't really live in a society that where there's a lot of that around.
Yep.
Everybody's very impatient,
Yeah.
and
Well, I
people
mean,
don't stick at stuff.
yeah. Yeah, and not to sound like, I'm an old person because I think it's really easy when you make statements like this to me, but like, you look at like the pace of modern life right now. Like, I was talking to somebody, I forget even who right now, but about like the ability to have a cell phone in your hand that instantly answers any question you've ever had or could have in a way that like I know when I was a kid, like I would wonder about stuff, and the only way for me to know about it was to remember it long enough to like go to the library and look it up on an actual like hard copy encyclopedia. Versus right now where anything I could ever want to know is at the palm of my hand. And I think there are wonderful and beautiful and amazing things that brings us. But one of the places where you can see a challenge in it is that ability to be patient with things and to understand that like stuff takes time and is hard to do. And even in people who seem to have mastered the thing, those individuals will still tell you it's an incredible amount of practice. It's an incredible amount of work. It's an incredible amount of patience with yourself as a person to get there. I for a few years taught some meditation stuff, and one of the things that, like one of the basic skills that you learn in that is about sort of focusing your mind on something, right? So commonly you focus your mind on the breath and breathing in and out. And you get new students that come to learn that, and they get really frustrated really quickly with themselves about like, my mind keeps wandering and it keeps going in different directions. And a lot of the teaching around that is like, right, you need to just be really patient with your mind and understand that like it is doing what it naturally does. It naturally gets distracted and goes places. And like I've had the very good fortune of knowing like some pretty amazing meditators that particularly Tibetan monks and things like that have been some really, really skilled, really long-term dedicated practitioners to learning how to do this. And they say the same stuff. When you talk to them about it, they're like, "Oh no, my mind wanders all the time. Like I've just learned to be much more patient with it when it happens, and that way I don't get distracted by being frustrated with the fact that my mind is doing what it normally does. I just very quickly go like, oh, I'm focusing on that noise outside. I'm just going to bring it back to my breath. And I think for many of us, like that that need to fill all of the spaces and all of the time and all of the everything with activity, and takes away from the opportunity to learn how to just be and be okay in those moments and be patient with the fact that like it's not all going to happen immediately and right away. And again, I think that's just really, really hard work that's hard work for anybody to learn how to do. And I think especially if you've got some trauma stuff or some fear stuff or whatever that's coming into your mind and into your space a lot, the need to get that out of there is so great and understandably so difficult for somebody to do.
Yeah. I heard this phrase a while ago called psychological flexibility.
Mm,
And the way it was described on this podcast I was listening to, I thought it was great. And how it would, how I would kind of describe, I give an example of psychological flexibility on the back of what you've just said. I would talk about the frustration and then being frustrated about the frustration.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yep.
you're trying to meditate,
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
you're trying to meditate, you're trying to be peaceful, and then the voice keeps on coming in and disturbing you, right? And then you get frustrated because you're trying to be calm and
Yep.
empty your mind and beginner's mind and Buddha stuff, all that sort of right. So the frustration comes in, and then the frustration comes in about the frustration,
Yes.
and then the frustration
Just
mounts,
builds and balloons
builds
and
and
yeah.
builds. And when I think about that, I also think about my own worrying about worrying,
Yes.
right? So it tends
Yep.
to, as a guy I listen to sometimes called Michael Neal says, we become a moron, right? We've got more on our mind. You know,
Yep. 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 Yep.
the
Yep.
frustration sits on top of the frustration, sits on top of
Exactly.
the
Yeah.
frustration. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think it's easy to fall into that. Again, I think it's easy for any parent to fall into that, but I think, particularly when the adoption process creates extra layers to that parenting complexity, right? Like, I've definitely been in those moments where I'm like, especially when my daughter was really young, and I would have moments of like, she's having a temper tantrum or a meltdown, and like in my mind, I'm like, I know what I need to do right now. I need to stay calm, and I need to just wait her out and not get frustrated and whatever. And yet I get frustrated and it builds upon itself because why can't I just stay calm and just relax, kind of a thing. And I think that same kind of a thing in many different ways will manifest itself that um, you know again to that point, like I actually really like that sort of idea of just sort of the frustration about the frustration building upon itself kind of a thing in a way that distracts us from the really good stuff that's also going on a lot of the time because I'm so focused on worrying about things and wondering and needing to know what caused something that I end up losing sight of the stuff that's going on all the time. And I think that can be part of it too, is like, how do you distinguish in anything, but especially when you're talking about your own children, like how do you distinguish what caused that? I mean, you'll see this in families that have a child biologically, right? Where there's like a conversation of like, is that my genetic material or your genetic material that's causing this kid to do this kind of a deal? And the reality is even in that case, parents also understand that like, well, it's actually not just you and I. There's like all these other people, all these other influences that are changing how our kid sees the world and how they interact within it. And you bring just that extra layer of complexity when you're talking about a child that you've adopted or moved through an adoptive process with that like where and how do I understand these behaviors? Are they doing this because of something I did? Are they doing this because of something somebody else did? And who was that somebody else and what was it? I think is it's a natural thing for us to wonder about. And a lot of the time, honestly, it's kind of like it's not a question you can answer. It's a bit of a fool's errand to try to. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. Like the reality is what happened is in the past, and all we can try to do is to move forward in a different kind of a way. In the same way that, like, if I break my arm and I go and get an X-ray and they look at my arm and it's broken, the story about how it got broken is interesting to the doctor, maybe. But the reality is to fix it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I got it crushed in a doorway or hit with a hammer or whatever. The repair, I mean, it's an oversimplification, but like the repair process is going to look the same. The need to fix or to do things is going to look the same. Um, and in similar fashion, I think with parenting, like trying to figure out who or what or where things came from is so complicated that like people write books about it and even they don't really know, you know?
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
rabbit hole. We that it's probably one of those things that we know that we don't need to disappear down that rabbit hole, and yet
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
do, right? And
But
so
it's natural too. I know like in some of our programs where we work with kids with pretty significant trauma stuff, like one of the big things that we've started looking at over the last, I don't know, 10 years maybe ish, is like how do we teach our adult staff how to play with kids again? Because for many of them, for many of them, many, especially our newer staff, like oftentimes aren't that far removed from being kids in the first place. Like they're 21, 22, 23 years old, but they've forgotten how to play with a kid. They don't have them necessarily themselves or whatever. And so that like joyful, imaginative play stuff that kids need to do, sometimes our staff have forgotten how to do it. And so there's like whole trainings that exist that like help you learn how to do those kind of things again. And I think that's to me, that balance is like if you're going to spend, if you're going to spend an hour reading about trauma and where trauma comes from, you're going to spend an hour reading like Ghosts from the Nursery, spend an hour reading about like how to create the most fun and engaging time with your kid that you can, and make sure that you're doing both of those things together. It's one of the things oftentimes when I'll work with families and kids will be getting in trouble for something or whatever, one of the first gut instincts is what do we take away from this kid? And it's not to say that there should not be consequences for it, but to me anyway, oftentimes what's more important is to really look at what is the value that this thing has for this child, and if that value is really big, it may be a thing to use, but maybe it's a thing to use not by taking away, but a thing to use by augmenting or increasing or supporting the problem that this kid's having. So if I'm not doing homework and I love to play a sport or I love to have this job in the community that I have or whatever, rather than taking that away from the kid, how do we use that thing that they really love and enjoy to help build up the area that they're struggling in.
yeah.
So that again, that kid isn't in that downward spiral of, right, everything is bad. I'm not doing my homework. I can't play basketball anymore. I don't, whatever it is kind of a deal. Yeah.
You interesting point. Going down this idea, the medical model of
Yeah.
fixing.
Hmm.
Um, I think because a lot of like mental health stuff comes from physical health stuff.
Yes.
But then somebody decided it would be a good idea to rather than talk about mental disease, they talk about mental health.
Yep.
Yet it's still really
Yes,
mental
exactly.
disease.
Yes. No, we've
It-
we've we've given it a nicer label, but not really changed the activity
yeah.
oftentimes. Yeah.
And I was just thinking about the most significant that thing that I've learned from adoptive parents is the savviest ones, is it's not about fixing the kids, it's
Yeah.
about growing our capacity.
Yep. No, I like that a lot. And I think, again, like, when you look at like the underpinnings of psychology and things along those lines, right? Like we've known, we've for, just humankind has known, frankly, for a long time, like the more you focus on something, the more you're going to get it. So, if you're focusing all your time on your trauma, then you're just going to have that trauma be more present, in everything that you're doing. If you're focusing, as much of your energy as you can on the goodness and all of that, the better. And I think, again, to that point at the start, like the idea that at our core, what are we? Are we these flawed and broken things that have had all of these negative things happen to us and creates this human being that is at its core broken? Or are we in reality these really like amazing creatures that are capable of so much resilience and so much um, joy and happiness and love that there are ways that if we focus on those parts of ourselves more, will we grow it? And again, I think you have to be really careful not to say to someone who's got trauma that like, oh, well, you just need to get over it. Like it's not that message at all. It's not the message of, if you just stop focusing on it, it wouldn't be as present. I do think that there's more opportunity for parents to consider that as they talk about their kids. That, that kid might not be as focused on it, but if I'm always bringing it into the environment for them, then it's going to become their focus more and more. But again, I think that the important bit in it is to find that balance between those two things of like, I'm going to acknowledge the fact that this trauma exists, and we're going to really focus a lot on all the places and times and spaces in which it doesn't exist for you. And how do we strengthen those while at the same time recovering from these other ones? Yeah.
Yeah. Because if we think they're broken, they're going to think they're broken.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and again, I think, like the need for the want and the desire to find a cause for a challenge that your kid is dealing with. And in finding that cause to then figure out, oh, this is how we fix this. This is what we're going to do to make it better, is a natural and normal and understandable thing for any parent that loves their kid to have. If I can find the cause, then I can fix it and we can make it go away. Um, and while that may be true, the other approach to that is the cause doesn't matter because it's in the past. The only thing that matters now is what's the cause to help this young person be happy, and how can we find those things and focus more on that stuff.
Yeah.
And being able to find the right balance
Yeah.
between those two things for kids and take them where they are. I mean, that's the other piece of it for me is like, again, there may be moments at which for that child or for that family or whatever, that right now it really is important to talk about my trauma stuff because that's so present for me in some way. It's coming up. I had a kid that I worked with many years ago who had a trauma on a particular holiday, and it was a really, really horrendous thing that happened. And every time that holiday would come up, that trauma would come up for them. And it was an understandable thing, like, oh, this holiday's coming, it's going to trigger some of these memories. And so for quite a while, part of the thing was like, okay, well, we know this is coming. How do we help prepare for the difficulties and challenges that are going to come? And as he started to get better control over those things, the focus became less on how do we control the negative in this to how do we create a different experience for you of this holiday. So that instead of focusing on the bad stuff, which we needed to do for a while to get to a place where that didn't turn into this huge, ugly, horrible experience for you, instead of focusing on that, now we can focus on how do we actually make this an enjoyable time for you? How do we make it something where you feel connected and safe and in relationship with people in a way that has a more positive implication to what that holiday is for you? And and I think that's the part where sometimes the swing gets stuck. We focus on reducing and eliminating the trauma without focusing enough on what we're going to replace that with. And how do we build both of those things at the same time? Kind of a deal.
Yeah. I think there's genius as you were discussing exemplifying that just now. It reminded me of something you said 5 minutes ago that I think is genius, right? So we've got an hour, right? We can either read a book about trauma or we can read a book about playing with our kids, or I
Yep.
guess you could even just play with your kid. It might be a
Yeah,
different
right.
thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But that in that simplicity there
Hmm.
there's something very strong
Hmm.
for me.
Yeah. No, I get that. I think it's also just, I mean, honestly, it's what makes being a parent, it's what makes being a kid fun, right? Like, I certainly had things in my own life growing up and stuff like that weren't the best experiences. But I also remember, I was just talking to my mother the other day about going over to my grandmother's house and what an amazing and fun space that was for me to go to. She lived in like a little place in the country, and it was just I don't know, a very sort of special place to go. And so like, which of those two memories are better for me to focus on? Is it better to focus on that fun, enjoyable space that I had, or is it better to focus on one of the things that maybe weren't as pleasant? Um, and finding the time for both is hard. And so then you got to think about, well, which am I going to invest more of my time in, and
Yeah.
what's the best outcome for me in investing those times?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does this does this broken, this word broken,
Mm.
does that come from religious circles? Do you know?
My guess. I mean, I think that there's a lot of that. Like, I mean, you see it a lot in religious communities anyway, right? This
No,
idea of
but
like,
that we're all broken.
yes.
I,
Well, and
I,
the idea of like, what are we at our core, right? At our core, are we something? And you do see this in different world religions, right? You see somewhere at your core, something is fundamentally wrong with us that we have to work against as human beings in order to, get to a better place, kind of a thing. And then you have other ones where there is ideas that like, no, at your core, you are perfect and wonderful and great. And it's really just about learning to let go of maybe some of the negative stuff in there to remain in that. And I I think that there's probably a lot of places in which different things come from, right? I mean, you look at like the educational system, like, for how long was the focus of education, you need to sit quietly and listen to what I tell you to do and just repeat it over and over again. And that was the model for education for how many generations of individuals. And even now, we're just starting to learn, like, actually, there's a lot of good in giving children permission to like explore and play and gain skills through experience. I worked for an organization for a while called Outward Bound, which does like experiential learning kind of stuff. And the program that I worked in for them was on Thompson Island, which is in Boston, and we often had programs where we would bring kids from the city of Boston out onto the island to learn some different stuff. And one of the things that we worked on a lot was math and science. And one of the best ways that we did that was we had an estuary, a place where like salt water would come in and then create like a little saltwater pond almost kind of. And we would have the kids go down and like, here's a bucket, go and like collect different types of creatures. And then we're going to do the math to figure out like what percentage of crabs to whatever you found. And kids, we talked to teachers that were like, amazed that like this kid who hated math and hated science would go out and do this thing and do the math and knew how to do it and did it well. And you'd have the teacher like, I don't get it. Like this kid hates doing division. They hate doing multiplication. How are they doing it here? And it's like, well, they're learning in a different way. They're not being asked to sit and look at numbers that have no meaning and respond to that and just rotely react to it. They're being given a space, and they're being given a space where they're outside and in a beautiful location and doing some really fun stuff. Of course they're doing better with it in those environments. And I
Yeah.
and I think, to extrapolate that out to the stuff that we do as we're parents and raising our children, to the best extent that we can, right? Like we all have different resources and time and availability and all of that. And I think, as parents, it behooves everyone to just be really patient with like there's only so much anyone can be expected to do. And unless you have all the resources in the world, um, you have to be patient with the fact that you're not going to be able to do every single thing the best way that you ever wanted to. But I think the more that we find those times and create those spaces for our children, the better, because that's the stuff that's the stuff I remember 40 years after being a kid and hold on to are you know, those moments of joy and fun and silliness and goofiness, and some of the moments of sadness and anger and all of that kind of stuff. But um, you know, we certainly can do a lot to intentionally create those opportunities with our kids.
I went on an outward bound course.
Oh, get out of town.
Yeah. I don't know whether the UK and the US people are still together or not, or whether
But
it was two different,
no,
two
it's an
different.
internet. There's a lot of affiliation around the world, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because what struck me was the culture. So
yeah.
there's that. there's that a phrase. I think I mentioned this to somebody else a couple of weeks ago. I heard this great phrase: "Culture eats strategy for breakfast."
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'd been in the scouts and done all the map make, the map
Yep.
finding
Yep.
and all that sort of stuff, orienteering, and then in one sort of culture, and I thought that was kind of it was a more encouraging culture than a classroom's culture, right?
Yep.
But then I went on this outward bound course, and we were doing the same stuff, but we were doing it in an outward bound culture,
Yep.
which was another four steps on in terms
Yep.
of it's supportive thing, and that got me thinking about the culture of a household,
Yep. I think the culture of the household, I think again, like what culture
of the
are
family.
all
Yeah.
of us creating around family, around adoption, around all of that. Um, yeah, there's a lot of really rich opportunity to like look and the thing with like an outward bound, like, having had worked with them for quite a while, um, there was so much intentionality that went into that. There was so much like, we would come to the folks that facilitated stuff, like we would come together every year at the start of the season and do like a long weekend together. And some of that was learning technical stuff. Like they're definitely worth it, like making sure that we still remembered how to belay correctly, because obviously things like that are super important. But so much of it, like in moments of like where it was clear that we were working on it, and in other moments where, as I had been there longer and got to see behind the curtain a little bit more, I was like, oh, you guys set that whole thing up. We didn't even know that what you were doing was creating an opportunity for us all to get to know each other in a different way or whatever. It just seemed like this natural thing that just happened. But there was so much intentionality put to how do we create these moments that become the culture of who and what we want to be, and thus pass that along when we're working with the young people that we work with, or with the adults that we work with, whoever you're working with for that. And I think the same thing within families. Like, what are we doing to lift ourselves out of the day-to-day drudgery of just getting through today to tomorrow, which there are some days you just got to do, right? But how do you lift your head up and sort of think about, well, what do I want the culture of my family to be? What are the things I want to be sure to like bring into our environment so that we are doing these things on a regular basis? Because I know that that's going to bring more joy, more connection, more relationship, more of all of that. And that's the stuff at the end of the day. Like the more connected and in community we feel, the more positively we see things. It's the one of the when you look at like research on who recovers well in therapy, one of the bigger indicators for whether someone will have a positive outcome to therapy, is the nature and richness of the relationship between the therapist and the client. Not about how good I am at cognitive behavioral therapy or how good I am at EMDR or whatever. It's about like, do you believe that I believe in you? And do you believe that I can help you and we can work through this together? Because if you believe that, there's a much better chance you're going to have a positive outcome than whether I'm the best tactician at something on earth. And that's again, that's all culture, right? That's all about the contract, the social engagement between you and I kind of a thing. And the same thing is true with and with our kids and how we raise them. Yeah.
It's about the relationship, isn't it? I think
Yeah.
the relationship, and I've heard similar kind of stuff where the relationship, uh, the space that's created in the relationship between the therapist and the client is the number one thing.
Mhm.
It is all about the atmosphere. And I've been watching a few TV shows recently where you see you see the and this has been both British and American um, TV shows where the client argues with the therapist.
Hmm.
And then there's another one, a British one, it's on, I think it's on Netflix now. A British thing no, it's Paramount actually. It's just come out, where it's couples therapy, and the bloke keeps on skipping it because he's got other stuff on, like trying to.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating stuff, especially the arguing bit,
Hmm.
arguing with you, arguing with the therapist. I
Yeah.
just that's a symbol that surely that's a signal that the relationship has isn't where it needs to be, right?
Can
From
be.
one side or the other.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think even within that, like, what's the nature of the argument or the disagreement or the right? Like, is it done in, and similar again to like between you and your children or whatever. Like, there are times when my daughter and I argue where it is like it is a productive, engaging conversation between two people with different views that respect and love each other. And there are times when we have argued where that stuff has disappeared somewhere into the background, and it's just I'm mad at you and you're mad at me, and we're not even really talking about the thing we were arguing about originally. We're just right, kind of a thing. And I think again, like when we think about how we are as parents and how we're raising our children and finding that balance between acknowledging the loss that may have existed or the harm that may have existed that brought this child to me through adoption. Um, Finding that ability to focus on developing the positive relationship and maintaining that positive relationship is going to you're going to have to rely on building intentional time where you are enjoying each other and having fun and doing silly things and laughing and being silly and also doing like hard things sometimes that have really good outcomes kind of a deal, but that's the way you build that relationship that's more resilient to the bad or the difficult or the loss that has happened. Because that's the stuff ultimately you fall back on. There's a guy, Charlie Applestein, who wrote a book called No Such Thing as a Bad Kid. And one of my favorite metaphors, he has a lot of metaphors, but one of my favorite metaphors from him is about um, that child development is like building a foundation on your house. You put it in one brick at a time. Every time you tell your kid you love them, every time you change their diaper, every time they have a positive interaction with you, you're putting in a brick into that foundation. And the more bricks you build, the more solid and steady a foundation you have, so that when there are storms and the wind is blowing and all of this other stuff, that house is sitting on such a solid foundation that it can weather those things and still be a warm, safe, dry place for someone to live in. And that same idea of like, how do we grow intentional relationships with our children that focus on um, every interaction I can, having it be a positive thing, every interaction I can, having it be a joyful, wonderful moment. Because those are the things that are going to make the difficult, challenging stuff that came and or will come, um, more manageable, more solvable.
Yeah,
Yeah,
brilliant. That feels like a great place to bring it in, Matthew.
you bet.
Yeah. Thank you, listeners. Thank you, Matthew. We'll
My
speak to you
pleasure.
again very soon. Take care. Bye
Awesome.
bye.